Hello, seventh graders. This is Mr. Shear, and today we are talking about the Lewis and Clark expedition. And this expedition is often called the Corps of Discovery. Just real quickly before we begin, today and tomorrow your assignment is an Edpuzzle. This will be a 2-day Edpuzzle and 2-day topic. So we'll do part 1 of their journey today, part 2 tomorrow. The Edpuzzles are long. They're 20 minutes each day. But yeah, you'll be able to get through it. And then just a quick note about this video. I'd recommend that you either watch this video or attend the Google Meet. But the Google Meet is going to be me going over this same information today because it's pretty dense information. So if you want to hear it live, you don't necessarily have to watch this video. If you don't like to come to the Google Meets, I would recommend you continue watching this video. You can do both. Quick reminder, we have done 5 out of 6 of these early notable expeditions to Washington. Of course, we're doing Lewis and Clark, the most famous one today. And it's mostly famous because it is the first overland by foot expedition out to the Pacific Ocean and to Washington. So just a little background. This expedition is funded and dreamed up by Thomas Jefferson, our third president. At this point, the United States is about 25 years old. A lot of this expedition is inspired by the purchase of the Louisiana Territory, which doubled the size of the United States. And of course, the expedition is heading to the mouth of the Columbia River, and they are mostly in search of a Northwest Passage. So a little bit about the Louisiana Purchase. Napoleon is the dictator president of France, and he's at war with the English, and he is willing to make some money quick and to sell off the French land held in what is now the United States. So Robert Livingston and future President James Monroe go to France, and they negotiate with Napoleon to purchase this huge section of land that's going to double our country. Now, Jefferson had asked them to go over there and negotiate this, and what Jefferson really wanted was this little circle up here, and he was willing to pay $10 million for it. He wanted, basically where New Orleans is, in part of Florida, he wanted the mouth of the Mississippi River. Instead, they are able to purchase, instead of $10 million, they pay $15 million for all of this land. It is a crazy good price, even 200 years ago, and it doubles the size of the United States. So that's the Louisiana Purchase. Now, once you have this new territory, well, you need someone to explore it. So Congress approves money, and Jefferson turns to his trusted secretary. Now, by secretary, they mean assistant, Meriwether Lewis. And he entrusts Meriwether Lewis, who he's known since Lewis was a little boy. Jefferson entrusts him to hike through the Louisiana Territory or travel through the Louisiana Territory with the goal of getting all the way to the Pacific Ocean. They've got 3 main objectives: study the climate of wildlife and mineral resources of the land. So study the land, find a route across the western half of the continent to the Pacific Ocean, a Northwest Passage perhaps. That's why they're heading to the Columbia River, which they still don't know where it goes. And learn about the Indian nations who live in the territory. Also, let the Indian nations know that it is now U.S. land. Thomas Jefferson, by the way, is a very, very curious man. He's got one of the world's largest libraries. He reads voraciously, and he is convinced that this doubling of our country is absolutely imperative to our long-term success as a nation, and he is convinced that by doubling it, that what we really need is to have a country that goes all the way from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. His goal is to create the United States that we have today. It's really his vision. And he knows he needs to get somebody out there walking across the land in order to make that happen. In his library, he's got lots of books about what might be out there, and believe it or not, Jefferson, very highly intelligent president, was convinced that Lewis and Clark would see woolly mammoths. He was convinced he might come across something like unicorns, even dinosaurs. Some maps describe the West as a landmass of erupting volcanoes and mountains of undissolved salt. He had no idea what was out there. Like if you read the bottom bullet there, he thought he might come across 7-foot-tall beavers, skinny buffalo, woolly mammoths, pterodactyls. And at that time, the largest mountains, just so we know like some perspective, the largest mountain in the original United States is the Blue Ridge Mountains, which are 6,500 feet. The Rockies top off at about 14,000 feet. So they're twice as big as the largest mountains that the original United States had. Also, there are no maps. Don't forget, at this point, we still think California might be an island. We have no idea what the United States looks like. They also had no idea that the Rocky Mountains were so big, and many, many, many people who had spotted the Rocky Mountains from a distance thought that the Pacific was right on the other side. It is not. So they're literally, Lewis and Clark are charting new territory. The maps are blank, and Lewis and Clark will be the first people to chart the area, discover the animals, discover the plant species, and really navigate this whole world that has just opened up to us by buying the Louisiana Territory. So just a little bit about Meriwether Lewis. He was born in 1774 in Virginia. He was a great outdoorsman. He's very highly intelligent. He's got a scientific mind. He grew up close to Jefferson. He'd been a soldier, and he spoke multiple languages. After the expedition, he will go on to become the governor of the Louisiana Territory for about 3 years. However, he does die, spoiler alert, of mysterious circumstances. Most people believe he committed suicide at an inn in Tennessee on his way to Washington, D.C. He was a man plagued by depression at times. Very serious, very scientific, great outdoorsman, but some people theorize he might have been bipolar. So he had very, very happy ups and elations, and then very, very big downs and sadness and darkness. That is the opposite of William Clark, who is Mr. Steady, Mr. Consistent. William Clark was Lewis's boss in the military, and Lewis is recruited first by Thomas Jefferson, and he decides that he needs a co-leader, and so he reaches out to his old boss, a man he respects, William Clark. William Clark is 7 years older than Lewis. He's born in 1770. He's a retired soldier, and he agrees to go along the expedition. He's also known as somebody with pretty good sense of humor and very consistent nature. Even keel, level-headed, always has a good solution in mind, good with people. After the whole expedition, he'll go on and become the governor of the Missouri Territory, and he actually becomes the governor of Native American Affairs. He's an advocate for Native Americans for the rest of his life, meaning he's always looking out for Native American interest after the trip, and he actually goes on to adopt Sacagawea's children after her death. So there's some hope of trade with the Native Americans, but Jefferson does send out Lewis and Clark with instructions to be friendly. He wants this to be a peaceful exploration. He does not want this to feel like a conquest for the Native Americans. All right, here's a map. It starts in St. Louis, travels up the Missouri. At the Mandan Village here, I love saying Mandan Village. I don't know why, but at the Mandan Village here, that's where they meet Sacagawea. They head over the Rocky Mountains in Montana and Idaho, and then they raft the Columbia River. I'm going to tell you that a lot, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. You're going to hear this a lot. Here's another map of it. And really, this is a big adventure, so I'm going to break it up into 7 parts. And I'm going to start with the actual journey now. So, phase 1, they're on the Missouri River. They leave in May of 1804, and they're on the Missouri River until October of 1804. Phase 2, they then arrive at the Mandan village in October of 1804, and they stay the winter there till February of 1805. This is where they meet Sacagawea. Phase 3, I call this the Great Falls and Camillawat phase. This is from the Mandan village to the Rocky Mountains, and they have a couple just adventures in between. We'll talk more about these individually in a bit. Phase 4, crossing the Rockies, and they specifically go through the Bitterroot mountain range in Idaho, but that's the 4th phase. That's August to September of 1805. Phase 5, they raft the Columbia to the Pacific Ocean. That is August 1805. They finally reach the Pacific Ocean in November of 1805. So they left in May of 1804. They reached the ocean in November of 1805. Phase 6, they winter at Fort Clatsop on the Pacific Ocean near modern-day Astoria from November to March 1806. And then Phase 7 is their return journey home, which takes them from March to September. So we're going to go through each of these phases individually. We'll do half today, half tomorrow. So we'll start with Phase 1, which is the beginning of their journey. They start in St. Louis. They leave in May of 1804. And Phase 1 is until they reach the Mandan village. So again, here's St. Louis. Here's Fort Mandan. We're talking about Phase 1 being here. It's almost exclusively, they have a little bit of time on the Mississippi River, but it's almost exclusively them on the Missouri River. And it's of note, the Missouri River flows to the east here, and they're going upstream. So they're having to paddle against the current the whole time. So they officially leave at 4 p.m. on May 14th, 1804. This is their keel boat. They have a couple of these. They're huge. And they're traveling through what is now Kansas, Missouri, Omaha, Nebraska. And it is slow progress, man. It is hard work to go upstream. They lose the first member of their expedition, and the only person who will die on their trip when Charles Floyd dies pretty early on. So they left in May. He dies in August, and they believe it was appendicitis. His appendix bursts, and they just can't make him better. They don't have great medicine back then, and they're not able to save him. So one member does die pretty early on. They buried him in Sioux City, Iowa, and today he's got a marker. They then cross the Great Plains, and this map here is showing you the Great Plains. These are grass plains of our country. And this is where they really get some intense animal study. They discover coyotes. They discover prairie dogs, which they're fascinated with. But a lot of these animals were previously unknown in the United States. And so they also see millions upon millions upon millions of buffalo, an unimaginable amount of buffalo. They have one run-in with the Lakota Sioux, and up until this point, most of their interactions with Native Americans are friendly, but the Lakota Sioux run the plains. They are the strongest tribe on the plains. They've got use of horses, and the Lakota Nation, called the Sioux by Americans, don't necessarily like them trespassing through their land, so they ride up on a ridge, the Lakota do. They've got their bows and arrows pointed at Lewis and Clark. They take positions in their keel boats. They draw their guns, and there's a standoff until one of the chiefs, by the name of Black Buffalo, tells his men to stand down, and the Lakota Sioux just leave. But they become very, very, very close to being annihilated. The Sioux had the bigger numbers, and they would have definitely wiped out the whole expedition. The rest of the Indians they meet, the Yukon Sioux and others, they're bringing gifts. And it's important to note that what they're bringing is they're bringing medals and trophies. They're often getting dressed, Lewis and Clark are, in full uniform to look official, and they're telling the Native Americans both that they come in peace, but also that this is U.S. land now. So eventually they get to the Mandan village, and this is actually a combination of two tribes, the Mandan and the Hidatsu tribes. And in the Mandan village, there's a French fur trapper. They're there for about 4 months for the whole winter. It's a snowy, harsh winter, so they don't leave. And again, it's right here, Fort Mandan. And this is where there's fur trappers. So there are Europeans and white people who've made it this far out. And one of the fur trappers they meet is a man by the name of Jean-Baptiste, Charbonneau, Toussaint Charbonneau. And he is married to a Shoshone wife named Sacagawea, and they hire Charbonneau, it's his picture here, they hire him to be one of their guides. He says he's been pretty far out west. It just so happens that he's got a pregnant 16-year-old wife who he won in a card game named Sacagawea. He has another wife as well, but she doesn't go on the trip. So Sacagawea gives birth to a baby boy, Jean-Baptiste, in February of 1805 before they leave the Mandan village. And Clark actually delivers the baby. He's also a medical doctor. And they bring Sacagawea with them on the trip. But in the beginning, Sacagawea is kind of just like a throw-in to the trip. She's not seen as essential as Charbonneau. Pretty quickly, however, she establishes herself as vital in a couple key ways. One, she knows what roots and berries to eat. Two, she's a really hard worker. At one point, their boat flips in the rapid, and she's the one who rights the boat, and she's the one who saves all their gear. And number three, her presence on the trip gives it more of a family vibe. I don't know how else to say it, but it kind of diffuses a lot of the tension with the other tribes that they encounter, to have a female and have a female with a baby. So then they leave the Mandan village, and this next section is from Fort Mandan until they get to the Rockies here. It's really this area. And that's basically the Dakotas, so parts of North Dakota, and the eastern half of Montana. They have a couple unique things happen there. First, they are absolutely plagued by grizzly bears. Native Americans in the Mandan village had told them there's this giant, beastly, ferocious bear that will come after you, and they don't necessarily know what to make of it. Lewis and Clark don't. Well, they come across two grizzly cubs, and they pretty easily kill them. Lewis and Clark do. Actually, it was Lewis. And Lewis then writes in his journal that these aren't that big of a problem. Well, then he's out hiking one day, searching around for plants, and he comes across a full-grown grizzly, and Lewis runs into the Missouri River. For some reason, grizzlies can swim just fine. The grizzly elects not to chase him. Maybe it just didn't want to get wet. And Lewis miraculously lives, but he's like, oh my gosh, now I see it. And they see hundreds of grizzlies, to the point that they're afraid to leave their boats. And there's a lot of journal entries about grizzly bears. Again, this is the first that we'd ever had discovered of grizzlies. So it's remarkable. The grizzlies don't end up killing anybody on the trip, but they do kill a remarkable number of grizzlies. Lewis and Clark do. They kill 43, and they wound numerous others. They write a lot in their journals about how hard it is to kill the grizzlies, that some of them can take 10 bullets before they die. And then they get to the Great Falls in Montana, and this is a problem. They had heard from the natives in the Mandan village that there was a huge waterfall they might encounter. That's how they'd know they were still on the Missouri, because Missouri splits at some points. And so they get here. So the good news is they know they're still on the Missouri. The bad news is they have to carry those giant keel boats and all their gear 17 miles around the falls. Great Falls is a town now, and it's still there. It's still a waterfall in Montana. It is a series of 5 giant waterfalls. It takes them a month to carry all their stuff around and their boats around the falls. At some point, Lewis is exploring up ahead, looking for the best way around the falls. And he, at some point, actually comes to find the headwaters of the Missouri River, which is just a little mountain stream. And if you don't know, the Missouri River is actually the largest river in the United States. It's bigger than the Mississippi. It's huge. So they do discover the headwaters of the Missouri River. And again, it's just a mountain trickle. They show it in the Edpuzzle as well. It is tiny, but it's just fascinating to me that it turns into the largest river in the United States. And then the craziest thing happens. So they want to enter into the Rocky Mountains. They're now at the foot of the Rocky Mountains. And at this point, they know they need horses to get through the mountain range. They know the Rocky Mountains are huge. Lewis climbs to the top of the Continental Divide, which is the middle of our country in many ways, geologically. And he expects the Rocky Mountains to be small, but they are gigantic. He gets to the top. You can imagine his discouragement, and he knows he needs horses. So he goes off on a smaller scouting expedition, and they end up seeing Sacagawea's tribe. And Sacagawea's tribe, they bring her along as interpreter. She was stolen when she was 12 years old, Sacagawea was, and she was basically given to her husband as a way of paying a debt from the Hidatsu natives who stole her. So Hidatsu steal her. She has not been home in 4 to 5 years. They are lost. They haven't seen a Native American, Lewis and Clark haven't, in about 5 months while traveling across the the waterfall, the Great Falls things, and while traveling all across the Missouri River from the Mandan village. They haven't seen a native in months. They're lost. They don't know how to get through the mountains. They run into their first Indian. They chase him back to his tribe. And Lewis sits down to meet with the chief. And it turns out the chief, Cameawat, I don't know how to say it exactly, but the chief is Sacagawea's long-lost brother. Biological brother, same parents. It is, of course, an emotional moment. And as I like to say, it is an insane moment. To travel thousands of miles in a place that no one's ever been. Your only Native American guide is there because you hired her husband, who won her in a card game, and she runs into her brother, who is the chief of a tribe that could help Lewis and Clark. So of course, Cameawat gives them horses. Of course, Cameawat feeds them. And of course, Cameawat gives them a guide, a man by the name of Old Toby. And as I say, it's been 216 years since this event happened, and I still can't believe it. The chances of running into her brother are 0 and none, but it happened. That's really the end of part 1. That's enough for now. Enjoy the Edpuzzle. Again, if you watch this video, it's going to be the same information at the meet, so you don't have to come to the meet. I hope you guys have a great day, and as always, 7th graders, thanks for watching.